Okay, guys, today we're going to be looking at indicator 8.4, the resurgence of the conservative movement. Before we start this lesson, let's look at some of the things that you should know by the end of this lesson. You should be able to explain the political divides of the 1980s. You need to be able to describe some of the past influences on liberals and conservatives. You're going to need to be able to describe Jimmy Carter's presidency. You're going to be able to explain the Iran hostage crisis. And you will be able to describe the presidency of Ronald Reagan and his impact on economics and the Cold War during this period. Okay, so make sure that you jot these down. You can put them at the end of your note sheet, or you can jot them down on another sheet of paper. Make sure you attach them with your notes if you do that. And then also make sure that I check these notes once you have completed. So let's look at the first thing. Let's look at political divide in the 1980s and what are going to be some things that you're going to need to know. You should have a sheet with this chart on it already. And let's look at the physical views or the monetary views of the liberals and conservatives. Let's start with the liberals. For the liberals, one of their main things was that the federal government should actively protect rights and welfare of the people. So that's what the liberals believe. They also believe that the federal government should have programs to aid and support those who cannot care for themselves. So that the federal government should do a lot, and this is what these liberals are pushing for. On the conservative side, you should know that large federal government threatens individual rights, and that's how conservatives viewed it. You should also know that states do the majority of the governing, so they're wanting to turn more power over to the states. And then finally, that personal responsibility that the government shouldn't have handout programs. So the government shouldn't have handout programs, and it's the personal responsibility, not the government's responsibility, to take care of these programs. So when we talk about money, these are the two views of the liberals and the conservatives. Let's look at their social views. For the liberals, they supported women's rights. They supported the right to choose regarding an abortion. And they also supported the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. For the conservatives, they were against abortion at any time during pregnancy, and they were against the Equal Rights Amendment. So there you go. That's the political divide of the 1980s between liberals and conservatives based on money and social views. Make sure that you record those things into your chart, and let's move on. Past influences on party divides. And again, we're looking at liberals and conservatives. And of course, you can write these down. For the Great Depression and the New Deal, liberals supported it, conservatives were against it. Civil rights movement, liberals supported it, conservatives were against it. Great Society supports anti-poverty plans and affirmative action, conservatives were against. Women's rights support changing roles of women and Roe versus Wade, which is the right to have an abortion. Conservatives were against. Response to Vietnam, there were peace marches and draft card burning. These people were called doves, the peaceful approach. And then for the conservatives, they feared a decline of family values with drugs, divorce, hippies, etc. And most of the conservatives were referred to as hawks, aggressive foreign policy, strong military, very similar to what Lyndon Johnson wanted, which we've already discussed. But anyway, these are some of the past influences and how liberals and conservatives looked at a lot of these issues. Let's look at Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter becomes president in 1977. He was elected in 1976. It comes after Gerald Ford. His administration was plagued with various problems. We saw some of this in the video that we've probably already watched by now. These were economic troubles of the Vietnam War and there were a lot of Middle East conflicts that were going on during this period. We had an increase in government spending under Jimmy Carter. Gasoline prices soared under Jimmy Carter, as well as the economy was not doing as good. It was very stagnant under Jimmy Carter. And interest rates were very high under Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter's presidency is going to be marred by a few things. Some of the things from the video, of course, that he dealt with, the Iran hostage crisis, which you see down here in the bottom left-hand corner. And then one of the good things is the Camp David Accords, which you see here with Jimmy Carter meeting with Anwar Sadat. Sadat is spelled S-A-D-A-T, from Egypt. And on the right is Menachem Begin. You can just put his last name. Begin is just B-E-G-I-N. It looks like Begin. But anyway, he got them to sign a peace agreement during this period, which was a pretty big deal because he was trying to solve the problems that were going on in the Middle East. So Jimmy Carter, not such a successful presidency, great man, did a lot. Heart was in the right place, just maybe not the best president that we've had. So let's move on and let's look at the Iran hostage crisis. And we've already discussed this and the events that involve this. Remember, all of this begins with the United States supporting the leader of Iran. He's called the Shah. Shah is spelled S-H-A-H. He's the leader of Iran. There was a growing resistance in Iran against him. And so the Shah is going to flee Iran, and he's going to come to the United States, mainly because, unfortunately for the Shah, he was dying of cancer. The leader that takes over in Iran is a guy named the Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini is spelled K-H-O-M-E-I-N-I. And he was a fundamentalist Islamic leader, so he believed in the religion of Islam. He backed the Islamic militarists that were in Iran, and they're going to take over, and eventually they're going to attack the U.S. Embassy in Iran. They're going to take 52 American hostages. President Carter tries diplomacy, tries all kinds of ways to try to get these hostages out, to no avail. Americans started to view Jimmy Carter's lack of regaining the hostages as him being soft on foreign policy. The hostages, though, were finally released when Ronald Reagan was sworn into office in 1981. And, of course, these are some pictures from that whole thing. I told you about how Jimmy Carter did try to rescue the hostages by sending in helicopters and U.S. planes to rescue these hostages, only to have it backfire when they crashed. And then this picture over to the right shows the hostages when they returned home. Here's a picture of the Ayatollah Khomeini down here in the bottom left-hand corner. And, of course, a picture of the actual hostages from this period. Let's next talk a little bit about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, we've watched a video on him already. We've got a pretty good sense for some of the things that he did. Some people refer to this as the Reagan Revolution. One thing that Reagan did was he tried to impact the economy, tries to get the economy up and rolling again. He's going to cut taxes of the wealthy to promote job creation and cut government spending. So he believes that if you don't tax the wealthy that much, that the spending would increase because they're going to create jobs, and these jobs are going to therefore translate into the economy becoming a lot stronger. He believed in an idea which we've discussed earlier called the trickle-down effect, that the wealth of the rich will make its way down to the poor. And starting new businesses and hiring workers would decrease unemployment. And again, here's sort of a picture of how trickle-down supposedly would work, and it's a political cartoon discussing that, how cutting the taxes of the wealth would help attribute to everyone else. And, of course, the Reagan Revolution poster over here on the right side. So this was Ronald Reagan's main ideas as far as the economy goes. A lot of people began to refer to this as Reaganomics, um, that the well-being of a country depends on the people consuming the goods and an increase in demand. And of course, here's a picture of Ronald Reagan here on the front of Time magazine, which you see there. He believed that by doing this, that he could promote more job creation. Again, the trickle-down economic effect. The wealthy would pay taxes proportional to their income, and that the lower and middle class would receive tax cuts. The idea was that people with money will spend more money. And of course, here he is explaining that on one of his State of the Union addresses, which you can see here. And it's showing you how he believes in a less federal government, more power to the states, and Reaganomics would be the way to make that happen, unlike Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. A couple of other things about Ronald Reagan that we need to know was Ronald Reagan believed in deregulation, that the government doesn't micromanage businesses as much. They're not going to be involved in all of these different things. This is going to lead to limited enforcement of environmental protection acts, which, of course, you see this up here, which has got the big deregulation stamp on it. We talked about some of those things under Nixon. The liberal view was that you should protect the environment, create new jobs in the process. The conservative view was that jobs are more important than the environment. So whichever side you fall on, that was how it was viewed during the 1980s. Reagan began to increase defense spending towards the end of the Cold War. He believed in something called the SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, which you see spelled out here in the center, also known as Star Wars. The whole idea behind this was that we would build a defense system that could take down nuclear warheads as they went up into outer space. We would be able to shoot these missiles down. So he began to spend tremendous amounts of money on defense from an ICBM attack. And of course, if you don't remember what an ICBM was, it's an intercontinental ballistic missile. Ronald Reagan's impact. Of course, Ronald Reagan leaves behind a very big legacy. If you remember from watching one of the videos that we've probably watched by now, it talked about his importance of ending the Cold War, possibly through the SDI, how he put pressure on the Soviet Union to eventually try to compete with us as far as our spending on the military, and it eventually leads to a fall of the Soviet Union and eventually the collapse of the Berlin Wall. His impact as far as Reaganomics and defense spending, here's what's going to be left behind. He's going to create huge deficits. An increase in defense spending tripled the national debt during that time. Many of the deregulated banks failed and led to massive bailouts by the government in the 1980s, after the 1980s and into the 2000s. We had a massive shift of manufacturing jobs from the U.S. to other countries after this period, and we saw a significant gap in the rich and the poor. So most new jobs were low paying, and there was less tax base for the government. All of this happens after Ronald Reagan. And so, some people would say, well, he was good for the short term, but the long term did impact us in a sort of a negative way. And we can still see some of those things even going on today. But Ronald Reagan's impact and legacy was that during the 1980s, he was considered one of the best presidents that the U.S. has ever had. A couple of quotes here, and I just threw these on here for you guys to look at. You can tell sort of how he felt about the Democrats in this quote. You can see the part that he was talking about government and how he didn't believe in a big government, and that the government was really part of the problem. And then he talks about being a leader. It's this is probably one of the best quotes I think on here. The greatest leader is not necessarily the one who does the greatest things. He's the one that gets the people to do the greatest things. And then his feeling on communism over here on the left-hand side. How do you tell a communist? Well, it's someone who reads Marx and Lenin. How do you tell an anti-communist? Is someone who understands Marx and Lenin. And of course, he's referring to Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, both communists and both who started the whole movement of communism. So again, that's going to be it for 8.4. Make sure that you go back and get these learning objective questions. I'm going to put them up here real quick for you. Write those down and then answer those. Once you're done, please make sure that I check off your notes and make sure that you review this as we get ready for our quiz, which will be coming up on probably Thursday or Friday. Could possibly be a little bit later. So, all right, I will catch you guys on the next one.